This is Acer freemani, or Acer X freemani, and this is probably the most popular of all the cultivars of that hybrid, and it's called Armstrong. And the Armstrong maple is noted as a fastigiate maple. An interesting thing about Acer freemanii, it's a cross between two Eastern American species, the silver maple, which is grows in very, very wet areas, and Acer rubrum, which also grows in wet areas. And both of those trees are notorious for being weak-limbed. They break and they fall over, and they're sort of tolerant of catastrophic weather. They rebound by producing new shoots from the base. But the hybrid between them is usually very tough, strongly branched, and so in many cases, Acer X freemani has superseded both Acer saccharinum, which is the silver maple, and Acer rubrum, which is the red maple, particularly in urban landscapes, because these are much more sort of predictable trees that are long-lived and strong. But they do still have that ability to tolerate wet soils, which again is very, very good for us in Vancouver. The flip side of that is, of course, that in the summertime, if we have drought, and we often do have drought, then these trees can suffer because they really want to have moisture in the summer. Now, like all maples, these have opposite buds and opposite leaves. The buds are very, very small. The flowers, I'll do the leaves first. The leaves are palmately lobed, and the lobes are reasonably well defined, and they have sharp teeth and kind of sublobes on the lobes. And Armstrong, typically 3-lobed, occasionally to 5-lobed, and a leaf that's, as you can see, sort of half the size of my hand. On vigorous shoots, you might get bigger leaves, but typically it's not a very big leaf, and that makes a difference in the landscape, because when these leaves fall to the ground, a big leafed maple all those leaves are going to stack up, and they're going to create problems for drains, street drains, and for cleanup. I mean, there's still quite a bit of leafage here, but these are fairly easy to handle. Now, I was going to talk about flowers. Again, this is a dioecious species, or a dioecious hybrid, I should say, and the flowers are apetalous. They come out in the spring, and you'll see a brief show, kind of typically reddish flowers, and this is again supposed to be a male cultivar, but some people have reported seeing samaras on Armstrong. But in any case, it's a relatively clean tree, and this particular cultivar is grown almost specifically for its allée effect. So an allée is an avenue of trees, typically planted both sides and symmetrical on both sides. And that's there are very few trees that we can do that with, but and the reason is that you might start out with uniform looking trees, but with age, trees tend to change and shift, whereas Armstrong maple is very, very consistent over its entire life. Carpinus betulus fastigiata. This is known as the fastigiate European hornbeam. The name hornbeam means horn means like horn, like hard, and beam is an Old English word for wood. And so European hornbeam is noted for its very, very hard wood. It's a versatile tree. It's a very, very good urban tree. In youth, this cultivar is very, very narrow and upright, and with age, you can see these are about 20 years old now, and these are starting to spread out. And so I wouldn't call these particularly fastigiate anymore, although the branching, the internal branching, is definitely fastigiate. These are members of the birch family, the Betulaceae, and as such they have alternately arranged leaves. They have simple leaves, and these leaves are basically obovate or ovate, or sometimes even elliptic, pointed and toothed, and the teeth along the margins are doubly serrate, and so they're fairly easy to recognize from that point of view. Very papery leaves. The buds alternate, and the buds are pointed, and they stand out, they stick out slightly from the stems. The stems are very slender and wiry. We don't typically get a lot of flowering on this cultivar. Occasionally after many, many years, like 60, 70, 80 years, you might get flowers. But when Carpinus betulus flowers, they produce, it's a wind-pollinated tree like all plants in the Betulaceae, so male catkins and smaller female seed catkins, and they have little, they look like little lanterns. They're kind of cute, but again, you're not going to probably see this in the cultivar fastigiata. As I said, it's a good, tough urban tree. It tolerates atmospheric pollution. It tolerates crummy soil. It tolerates heat, and generally performs very well. What it doesn't really want is it doesn't want a lot of shade. These are shaded, and these trees that are shaded, they tend to lose the branches that are most shaded. So sun tolerant, heat tolerant, but not particularly drought tolerant. Again, this is a tree like so many others that needs some summer moisture. If we have a very, very well established tree, that, it's been established for 20 years or so, then it might be able to tolerate our typical summer drought. But anything younger than that, it would need to be in an irrigated landscape. This is Euonymus fortunii, emerald gaiety. And this is a cultivar of a very, very interesting species, Euonymus fortunii. Euonymus fortunii produces variegated sports fairly frequently in nature. Now, a sport is what's known as a branch mutation. And so variegation like this is often the result of some screw up in the DNA, in the machinery. And if you find a branch, single branch that has this variegation, you can take that branch off and propagate it, and that's essentially what's done with many variegated plants, is that they're found in nature and then they're propagated, and this is what we have. But it's also interesting in that this is known, it's an evergreen shrub, but it's also an evergreen climber. And you wouldn't know it to look at it, but if you were to grow this up against a wall, it would be a self-sticking climber. And it's a very, very ratty looking climber, and this is why it's not often used as a climber, but more often as a ground cover. And so to grow it as a ground cover, you must prune it on a regular basis to keep it from sending off long stringy branches that want to climb. Now there's another issue with Euonymus fortunii, and that is that these small leafed forms, like I'm holding in my hand, they represent a kind of juvenile form of the species, and that once these things get going, once they're established in the landscape, and particularly if they're out in the sun, these are shade tolerant plants, but they also can grow just as happily in the sun. And if they're in the sun, they tend to get gradually bigger and bigger leaves, and the stems become not flexible like they are here, but they become stiff and more shrubby. And so if this shrub was not pruned and it was in the sun, it would form a shrub perhaps 1.5 meters or 2 meters tall. And so we'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So the great thing about a shrub like this is that it is versatile. It grows fast, and as long as it's pruned, it does very well. If it's pruned, it doesn't produce flowers, or it may produce flowers, but seldom will produce fruit. And this is like any other euonymus that we've talked about. This produces a capsule that opens up and exposes a bright orange seed. It is adaptable to a variety of soil situations. It can tolerate some drought, and like I said, it tolerates some shade and sun, and it looks best, I think, in an irrigated landscape where it's pruned back. Now, the last thing I want to say about Euonymus fortunei, it is a euonymus, and so you're going to see an opposite arrangement. But you're also going to see reversion. And what reversion means is that while we have a variegated branch like this, every once in a while you'll get a branch that is green, that's not variegated. And that's typically much, much stronger, more vigorous than the variegated part of the plant, and it will eventually overtake the variegated part. This is Fraxinus americana, what we call a white ash. This is a glorious time of the year for white ash. There are a couple of cultivars that are normally available in commerce. This one is called Autumn Applause, and it really does have fantastic autumn color. Now, Fraxinus are typically sizable trees, members of the olive family, the Oleaceae, and this particular species is noted for its large size. So these are relatively long-lived trees, probably last for a couple of 100 years or more, and they can easily reach sort of 25 to 30 meters if given the space. Now, these are trees of deep soils typically. That is ash or trees of deep soils. They really prefer to have well-drained soil that is moist, but they're fairly tolerant of high soil moisture in the winter, which is very, very useful for this part of the world where we often have a lot of moisture in the winter. Now, ash in general, that is Fraxinus species, have compound leaves. They're pinnately compound leaves, and the leaves and the buds are oppositely arranged, and we'll see with a close-up some of those details. The leaves are often arranged in an almost decussate fashion, that is, with pairs at right angles to the pair below. Generally speaking, toothed leaves, sometimes you can't see the teeth very easily, but these have relatively good teeth. And in terms of reproduction, there are two kinds of ash trees. There are ashes that have insect pollinated flowers, and those flowers are showy, and then there are the wind pollinated types, and this is one of the wind pollinated types, and so you basically don't see the flowers. Ash also are kind of run the gamut. They can have perfect flowers, they can have unisexual flowers, they can be monoecious or dioecious, and so they're really kind of a variety of things, a variety of reproductive strategies. And this is a dioecious tree, and most of the cultivars that we find are males. That means they don't produce fruit. The fruit of Fraxinus is a samara, but remember, a samara is just a winged single-seeded fruit. It's not like a paired fruit like a maple. So we have a tree that's relatively clean, big compound leaves, but the individual leaflets are relatively small. So this is a tree that once it drops all its leaves, there's not a lot of material to sweep up. We have more than enough of these planted in the city. About 20 years ago, people started to get interested in it, and we now have a lot of ash planted in the city. And this was a problem in the eastern part of North America. A lot of ash trees native. This is native to the eastern U.S., but also a lot of ash trees planted. And the introduction of the emerald ash borer, which is an insect that is actually able to kill ash trees, has devastated ashes in eastern North America. And so what we have here in Vancouver is a large ash collection. We're a little bit concerned that if we get emerald ash borer, it's going to wipe out all of those beautiful ashes that we have. But we're fairly confident that the emerald ash borer is not going to be a problem here. And the reason I say that is that these are just not the right kind of conditions for emerald ash borer as far as we can tell. This is liquid ambar, styraciflua. Liquid ambar is known as the American sweet gum. There are, of course, species in other parts of the world. Some of them have the name sweet gum, but this is an American species, and it grows in the southeastern United States and down into Mexico as well. And it's an interesting tree from a variety of perspectives, like a lot of perspectives. It's in an unusual family, the Altingiaceae. Not that you're going to know anything about that family, but it's characterized by having very, very tiny apetalous flowers. They don't really look like much. The fruits, however, look like little spiky balls, and they're called gumballs. And sometimes that's the common name of this tree. In the southern United States, it's often called the gumball tree as a result of that. It has very, very interesting compounds in the, if you pull off a leaf or break a stem, injure it, it smells somewhat aromatic, and those aromatic compounds are actually styrenes. They're precursors of plastics. And not that anybody's making plastic out of this, but in any case, this is a plant that has a leaf that looks a lot like what people consider a maple leaf. It is, palmately lobed, but you'll notice that it has an alternate arrangement, so it's very, very quickly you can see that it's not a maple. As very thick, almost leathery leaves, and they stand up. But as an urban tree, the liquid ambar has a bit of a problem in that it has brittle wood, and the branching is not always that tough. And so I was mentioning allays when I was talking about Acer freemani Armstrong. And people often use liquid amber styraciflua as an allay species because it looks so uniform when it's young, but it typically breaks up and falls apart. The crown gets all kinds of problems with it, and so it doesn't really make for a good allay tree. It's a good, I would call it a good park tree. And again, like the maple, it really wants that summer moisture, and it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't tolerate winter moisture very well, so it needs well-drained soil. So the fruits, as I say, can be messy, and particularly with a stressed tree. If a tree is under stress, then it tends to produce a lot of fruit, and that fruit then falls to the ground, and it's hard to walk on underfoot, particularly if you have flip-flops on. And it's considered a messy tree. On the bright side, however, it often has really spectacular autumn color, much better than most other plants in Vancouver, in fact. And so it's renowned for that. This particular plant is a cultivar called Worplesdon, and Worplesdon is very easily propagated. That is, you can nurseries just propagate it from stem cuttings, and so it's a very quick crop, and so it can be sold at a high profit, which is something that you need to be aware of in the industry. This is Persian ironwood, Parotia persica. This is a tree. It's a very, very large tree that is native to Central Asia and I think parts of Asia Minor. And it's characteristically a very, very broad spreading tree. There are a couple of selections that have been made that are slightly less widespreading, but in general, like Carpinus betulus vestigiata, even the narrow, even the cultivars that are narrow in youth eventually become very widespreading. And this is not a tree, for example, that should be used on a narrow street as a result. So you need a wide boulevard or a park to really appreciate this, in spite of what nurseries will tell you about the narrowness of certain cultivars. Now, there may be new cultivars that are narrow enough, but generally speaking, anything that I've seen is quite broad. Now, this is a fairly easy plant to recognize. The leaves are unusual. They look a lot like, if you remember, Hamamelis intermedia. They actually look a lot like those leaves. They are asymmetrical. They have toothing more or less only in the distal half of the leaf. And like Hamamelis, every single leaf on the branch is a different size and shape. So you could pick off every leaf and you could try to line up some that look the same, and you would be hard pressed to find leaves that are actually close to identical. So like other plants in the Hamamelidaceae, alternate leaf arrangement. These have very, very dark, kind of purple-black buds, and the branching is unusual in that the main branches are typically indeterminate. That is, they keep going and going and going and going, and the lateral branches come off at more or less right angles. And so you have very, very strong lateral branching on these trees. The bark is beautiful. With age, it starts to flake, and you get these beautiful shades of gray and white peeling off, and a little bit of sort of fawn color. And the autumn color in Parotia is often really spectacular. Starting now, you get this sort of coffee colored or sort of bronze purple, and then it's going to gradually go more red and purple. So The great thing about this tree, it's very, very urban tolerant, tolerates heat and drought and full sun. What it doesn't want shade, and it doesn't want poorly drained soil. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. In terms of flowers, very, very tiny flowers, apetalous. Again, these are wind pollinated flowers, and if I remember correctly, these are monoecious plants, so you're going to get both male and female flowers, but they don't really amount to much, and the fruit, if we can even find fruit on these trees, will not be particularly conspicuous. So this is pin oak, Quercus palustris. Palustri is I think it's a Latin word, and it means of the swamps. True to its name, Quercus palustris can tolerate wet ground. It also tolerates compacted dry ground, and that might seem a bit of a contradiction, but really what the tree is adapted to is low oxygen in the soil. So compacted ground is not much different than wet ground. There's just not a lot of oxygen that's available to the roots. And so this is probably one of the best plants for compacted ground, like you'd find around play fields or sports areas. And for that reason, it's very widely planted in the urban context, where you often have very poor soils. Now, this is a big tree. It's a 35 or 40 meter tall tree in nature. In the urban context, we seldom get more than say 25 meters. Pin oak is easily recognized by its straight trunk and excurrent branching, and I'm going to do a little dance here to show you what pin oak looks like. Pin oak, at the top of the tree, the branches stand up. In the middle of the tree, the branches are horizontal, and the lowest branches hang down. And if you see that, chances are you're looking at a pin oak. Like other oaks, of course, alternate arrangement. Pin oaks are in what we call the black oak group, and the black oak group are different than the white oaks. White oaks have rounded lobes, and the black oaks have pointed lobes, pinnately lobed leaves where the lobes are pointed. And with pin oak, we tend to have a bristle tip on the end of those points. Now the lobes are always irregular, but generally speaking, the sinuses are U-shaped or occasionally C-shaped, but that's a nice big U-shaped sinus. So the sinus is cut more than halfway to the midrib. The buds point outward. They're fairly small, and the acorns, if we find acorns, and we seldom find acorns, the acorns are relatively rounded, sort of a subglobose nut within that cup. This is red oak, Quercus rubra, and it's kind of interesting that at least in Vancouver, red oak is seldom turns red in the fall. It is if it does, it's a kind of sort of a rusty red. But even still, I mean, it does take on sort of reddish tints in the fall. This is a very big tree. Unlike pin oak, red oak has a deliquescent crown. That is, the branches keep branching and rebranching, and so it has a It often will have a central stem, but after about 3 or 4 meters, generally you start to get larger scaffold branches that break up that crown. Red oak can be recognized by its leaves, which typically have narrower and shallower sinuses than pin oak. And so when you look at the leaf blade or the leaf lamina, there's more leaf, there's more green leaf to it. And so red oak is a much better tree for tolerating shade, for example. But of course the best oak trees are out in the open, and red oak has a gorgeous sort of rounded, huge rounded crown. These can be very, very big trees, upwards of 30 meters tall. Alternate, of course, because it's an oak, and the buds look an awful lot like they do on the pin oak, and the acorns I think are even rounder than they are on the pin oak. But we typically in Vancouver, we grow so few of the oaks that we normally can recognize what we're looking at by just a couple of features. And so with red oak, we're looking at sinuses that don't go more than halfway to the midrib, nice kind of broad lamina, ovate outline that is broader toward the distal end of the leaf. In terms of the habit, of course, that broader habit, and less, and in the landscape, this is a tree that does not tolerate poorly drained soil. So we're probably planting it as much as pin oak, but often in places where it's not going to do very well. And the campus at UBC is a very good example of where not to plant red oak. And many, many years ago, a decision was made that red oak was going to be the dominant tree on campus. And the unfortunate thing is that our soils are very easily compacted. And so we have a lot of declining red oaks on campus. Main Mall is an alley of red oaks, and believe me, they're not very healthy, and that's because they don't tolerate compacted soil, and they would have done much better in deeper soil with some summer moisture. But that's what we have, so there you are. This is rhododendron Hansel. This is our first broadleafed evergreen shrub, I believe, but it's also our first rhododendron. And rhododendrons are fairly easy. Most rhododendrons are fairly easy to recognize in the landscape for a couple of reasons. One is that they have an arrangement, leaf arrangement that's not unique, but it's very distinctive, and that's what we call the clustered arrangement. And that means that we have leaves that are alternately arranged, in this case, alternately arranged, but they tend to be located toward the tip of the branch. And so you typically have these long stems with no leaves, and then leaves at the tips. In a landscape rhododendron like this, where the people who are doing the maintenance are pruning these on an annual basis, you can't see that so obviously from a distance. You have to get up close to have a look. But this is really typical of rhododendrons, to have this clustered arrangement. So another thing about rhododendrons, rhododendron is a very, very large genus. There are about 1,000 species of rhododendrons, but most of the rhododendrons that we grow in Vancouver in the landscape essentially have elliptic to ovate leaves, and some of those have a significant hair hairs on the significant vestiture of hairs. And that often shows up on the back side of the leaf. And when it's a kind of thick tomentum on the back of the leaf, we call that an indumentum. If you recall from our discussions of Magnolia grandiflora, it's something similar to that. It's very, very common in rhododendrons to have that indumentum. Rhododendrons are often grown for their flowers, and rhododendron collectors will grow rhododendrons that have really horrible looking leaves just because the flowers look big and showy. Landscape rhododendrons, on the other hand, are typically grown, or at least we hope they're grown, for foliage effect, because obviously if they're only going to flower for 3 weeks, why would you want to have put all your eggs in the flower basket? What you want is you want to have a good foliage plant, and Hansel is one of the best landscape rhododendrons for foliage display. Very glossy green leaves. It holds on to its leaves for years and years, which is great. So you get at least 3 years of leaf retention, which means that it is, in fact, very evergreen. And it also, it's flowering right now, which is unusual. It's not so unusual. They do occasionally put out what we would call precocious flowers, but flowers in rhododendrons are typically sort of funnel shaped, and they're held in clusters that we call trusses, T-R-U-S-S-E-S. And so the flower truss typically sits here at the top of a leaf cluster. And that's basically it for rhododendrons in the landscape. When they're pruned as heavily as they are pruned, like Hansel is here, then we're going to not get a very good display of rhododendron flowers, because the flower buds are produced in late spring. They ripen in the summer, and then they bloom the following spring. This is Rosa rugosa. Rugose means wrinkled, and when we get a good close-up of the leaves, you'll see just how wrinkled looking the tops of these leaves are. Rosa rugosa is known as the Japanese rose, or the beach rose, or Ramanas rose. It's got a variety of names. It's native to Northeast Asia, and it grows, it's a kind of maritime species. It favors the beach. It's a very, very prickly stemmed rose. There are roses that have big honking prickles, but this one has very, very small, large and small prickles all along the stems. So it's often used, the species is often used as a barrier planting for that reason. Like all roses, it has an alternate arrangement, and it has a kind of a radial phyllotaxy, that is the leaves all radiating around the stem. Like I say, compound leaf. The compound leaves are very distinctive in that they have a persistent pair of stipules at the base, and again we'll see that when with a close-up. And the prickles are not only on the stems, but they're also on the leaf rachis. But of course, there are other reasons for growing roses, and mostly it's for flowers. And Rosa rugosa flowers very, very heavily from about June onwards. Big show of flowers in June. The flower color can range from white through pink to red and purple. This is a purple one here. They typically flower for a month or 6 weeks, and then they sort of slow down and they start to produce these hips, which are the fruits of the rose. And these can be used for making tea or whatever. You don't want to eat them because there are bristles inside the hip that can irritate the throat. So Rosa rugosa is unusual among roses in that it tolerates very, very well drained, even sandy, infertile soil. Now, most roses will not survive with competition or with poor soils, or with shade. Rosa rugosa grows in the sun, but it tolerates incredibly infertile soil. I've seen it in sand dunes in northern Japan, growing very happily just in sand. This is a suckering shrub. It spreads by root suckers, and so it forms nice colonies.